"I don't need such children," the father said, and threw the bouquet. Chelyabinsk Siamese twins Anya and Tanya Korkin Chelyabinsk, early 1990. A young woman was lying on a couch in the ultrasound room. The pregnancy was proceeding normally, but the doctor suddenly stopped talking, carefully peering at the monitor. Then he ran the sensor over his stomach again. And more. His face became more and more serious. The doctor was silent, continuing to study the image. Finally, he put down the sensor and said slowly, "You're going to have Siamese twins." The diagnosis sounded like a verdict, because by that time in Russia no one had yet taken up the separation of conjoined children. The father of the babies was afraid to report the diagnosis. He got a call after giving birth. He came to the hospital, looked at his daughters and said, "I don't need these children," threw a bouquet of flowers in his wife's face and left. Chelyabinsk, spring 1990. Two girls were born in the maternity hospital, but the joy turned to horror in advance. The sisters were joined in the abdominal area. One liver for two, common blood circulation, fused tissues. The doctors shook their heads. In the USSR, such people were not separated. Never. But a young surgeon, Lev Novokrestenov, uttered a phrase that changed everything. "We will try." Anya and Tanya Korkin were born on April 9, 1990. These were zyphophagic twins, a rare pathology that occurs once in 200,000 births. The girls were connected from the sternum to the navel. They were connected by one liver, which worked on both. The twins' mother, a simple Chelyabinsk woman, saw her daughters for the first time only a few days after giving birth. The nurses were afraid to show her the newborns, not knowing how she would react. But the mother's heart turned out to be stronger than fear. "These are my girls," she said softly, looking at the tiny sisters in the same crib. "And I will fight for them to the end." In those years, there was no practice of separating conjoined twins in the Soviet Union. Moreover, the global experience of such operations numbered only a few dozen cases, and not all were successful. Many doctors believed that it was better to leave the girls, as at least they would be alive. Lev Borisovich Novokrestenov was already a well-known pediatric surgeon at that time, but no one in the country had performed such an operation. When he was asked to take on the separation of the twins, he understood. This will be the most difficult case in his practice. The medical team has been preparing for the operation for several months. We studied foreign experience bit by bit. It was not easy to get specialized literature in the USSR. They held endless consultations, simulated the course of the operation on dummies, and calculated every step. The main problem was the liver. This vital organ was shared between the two, and it was necessary to decide how to divide it so that both girls would receive a functioning part. A mistake would mean the death of one or both sisters. "I hardly slept before the operation," Novokrestenov later recalled. "I replayed every movement of the scalpel in my head. I understood that I was responsible for two lives." The operating team consisted of more than 20 people: surgeons, anesthesiologists, intensive care specialists, and nurses. Everyone knew their task. Everyone understood that they were making history. The operation began in the early morning of May 17, 1990. The girls were just over a month old. The doctors were waiting for them to get stronger, but it was dangerous to delay further. The older the twins got, the more difficult it would be to separate them. The first hours were spent preparing the operating field and determining the exact boundaries of the compound. It turned out that the situation was more complicated than the examinations showed. The girls shared not only the liver, but also part of the abdominal wall and several blood vessels. The most stressful moment was the separation of the liver. Novokrestenov worked practically as a jeweler. It was necessary to cut the organ so that each girl got a functioning part with sufficient blood supply. One wrong move and you'll start bleeding, which can be fatal. There was dead silence in the operating room. There was only the steady beeping of the monitors and the surgeon's clear commands. The assistants froze when Novokrestenov made another incision. Anesthesiologists monitored the vital signs of both babies. 8 hours later, the turning point came. The liver was divided. Every girl now had her own organ part. All that remained was to separate the remaining tissues and close the surgical wounds. When, 10 hours after the start of the operation, the girls were taken to different intensive care units, there was applause in the operating room. For the first time in the history of the USSR, Siamese twins were successfully separated. The post-operative period proved to be no less difficult than the operation itself. The girls were in critical condition for several days. Their bodies, accustomed to functioning as a single unit, now had to learn to work separately. Anya started having complications on the third day. Her part of the liver could not cope with the load. Doctors were fighting for her life around the clock. Tanya endured the postoperative period a little easier, but she also had problems with wound healing. The girl's mother practically lived in the hospital. She was allowed to see her daughters only through the glass of the intensive care unit, but she came every day, stood for hours at the window, whispered prayers. The scariest thing was seeing them separately, she later said. I'm used to them always being together. And now everyone was lying in their own crib, so small, defenseless. But Chelyabinsk doctors were considered one of the best for a reason. 2 weeks later, the girl's condition stabilized. A month later, they were transferred from the intensive care unit to a regular ward. And when Anya and Tanya smiled for the first time, the doctors realized that the battle had been won. The news of the successful operation spread throughout the Soviet Union. The central newspapers wrote about the miracle of Chelyabinsk, and television showed stories about girls and their savior. Lev Novokrestenov became famous throughout the country. Parents of Siamese twins began to come to Chelyabinsk from all over the USSR hoping for help. Novokrestenov received everyone, consulted, performed operations. The experience of separating Anya and Tanya became the basis for the creation of a specialized center for the treatment of complex congenital pathologies in Chelyabinsk. Foreign colleagues invited the Soviet surgeon to conferences and asked him to share his experience. The operation to separate the Korkin sisters was described in medical journals and included in textbooks on pediatric surgery. But for Novokrestenov himself, the main award was not scientific articles or the recognition of colleagues. The main thing was to see how two ordinary girls, to whom he gave a chance for a full life, were growing and developing. Anya and Tanya grew up as ordinary children. Yes, there were scars on their bellies, a memory of the time when they were one. Yes, they had to be seen by doctors all their lives. But they were alive, healthy, and happy. The sisters went to a regular school. The teacher who taught their class recalled that the girls were very friendly, although they were different in character. Anya is more active and sociable. Tanya is calm and thoughtful. They always stuck together, said the homeroom teacher. But at the same time, everyone was a bright personality. Anya had her friends, Tanya had hers. They just knew that they could always rely on each other. The story of their separation was not a secret, but the girls did not attract much attention to it either. The scars were hidden by clothes, and the sisters themselves tried to live a normal life, not standing out among their peers. After school, the girls chose different paths. It was symbolic. Once physically inseparable, now they could build their independent lives. And this was the best proof that Dr. Novokrestenov's operation was a success. Lev Borisovich Novokrestenov continued to work as a pediatric surgeon until his retirement. During his career, he saved thousands of children's lives and performed dozens of unique operations. But the separation of Anya and Tanya Korkin forever remained his main achievement. The Center for Pediatric Surgery, established in Chelyabinsk, has become one of the leading in Russia. Children with the most complex pathologies came here from all over the country, and many of them got a chance at a normal life thanks to the experience gained by Novokrestenov's team. The surgeon himself has always remained a humble man. In interviews, he always emphasized that the operation was the result of the work of a large team and not the merit of one doctor. I was just doing my job, he said. Yes, it was a difficult operation. But how could it be otherwise when it comes to children's lives? Every child deserves a chance. And my job as a doctor is to give him that chance. The story of the Chelyabinsk twins showed that Soviet medicine, despite all the difficulties of that time, was capable of real miracles. When the professionalism of doctors was combined with their humanity and willingness to take risks for the sake of patients, stories worthy of admiration were born. Years after the operation, Anya and Tanya came to the very hospital where their separation took place. They wanted to thank the people who gave them life. By that time, Lev Borisovich was already on a well-deserved vacation, but he specially came to the meeting. The elderly surgeon looked at the two girls and couldn't hold back his tears. In front of him were the very tiny girls he had fought for decades ago. Now each of them had their own life, their own plans, their own dreams. I've had hundreds of surgeries, Novokrestenov said, hugging his sisters. But your story has always been special to me. Because you were the first. And because you have proved that nothing is impossible when there is faith and professionalism. The sisters presented the doctor with a photo album containing pictures of their live school years, graduation, and their first trips. On the cover was the inscription, "To the man who gave us two lives instead of one." The 1990 operation in Chelyabinsk was a breakthrough in Soviet and Russian medicine. She showed that Russian surgeons are able to perform world-class interventions of complexity. The experience gained by Novokreshenov's team was used in subsequent operations to separate conjoined twins. In the years since that first operation, several more similar interventions have been performed in Russia. Not all of them ended successfully, such is the nature of this complex pathology. But each attempt was based on the experience of Chelyabinsk doctors. Modern surgeons working with such cases recognize that Novokreshenov's technique remains relevant today. Of course, more advanced equipment and new technologies have appeared. But the basic principles used by the Chelyabinsk surgeon are still the gold standard. The story of Anya and Tanya Korkin is regularly mentioned in medical textbooks as an example of a successful solution to a complex clinical problem. Medical students study this operation, analyze its stages, and learn from the experience of Soviet doctors. Anya and Tanya live a normal life today. They don't give interviews, they don't seek publicity. The scars on their bodies have long been just a part of their story, the story of a miracle that happened in the spring of 1990 in a Chelyabinsk hospital. The sisters are still very close, although each has its own path. The bond that was once physical has now become mental, but no less strong. When they are asked about that time, they, of course, do not remember anything. They were too young. But Mom told them this story many times. About how I was afraid of losing them. About how doctors fought for them. About how the whole country was watching their fate. "We are very grateful to fate," says one of the sisters. "We are grateful to our mother, who did not abandon us. We are grateful to the doctors who took the risk. We are grateful to everyone who believed in us. We have received the most important gift, the opportunity to live." During another holiday, a large family gathered in one of the Chelyabinsk apartments. There were two women sitting at the table, very similar to each other, with children and husbands. There was laughter, tea, and memories. Anya and Tanya were celebrating their birthday, the very day they were born as one being, only to become two separate people a few months later. There was an old newspaper clipping on the wall with the headline "Chelyabinsk Miracle" and a photo of a young Dr. Novokreshenov. "To life," said one of the sisters, raising her glass. "To those who give life." The second one picked up. And at that moment, somewhere in the city, perhaps another surgeon was preparing for the most difficult operation, believing that the impossible was possible. Because one day in the spring of 1990 in Chelyabinsk it was already proved. What do you think about this story? Write in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any amazing new stories. See you.